I have been very excited about this series, The Character of God. Now, you can go a lot of different directions with the character of God, but we are pulling 5 weeks from one verse. You think, well, that's got to be a big verse. Oh, it is. Exodus chapter 34, it says, and he passed in front of Moses proclaiming. Now, let me pause there. He passed in front of who? Well, that's God. When? Well, when Moses was getting the 10 Commandments. Not the first time, the second time. Maybe you remember the story that Moses went up on the mountain, he got the 10 Commandments, came down, and saw the Israelites had created an idol, a golden calf, and he smashed the tablets. Look, when you're breaking stuff that God made, that's a big deal. So God says, okay, we need to make him again, come back up here, and this time, when he's inscribing the 10 Commandments a second time on tables of stone, he says that God passed in front of Moses, and this is what God says about God. The Lord, that is in Hebrew, Yahweh, Yahweh. Almost never do you have a replication of the name of God twice. It's a big, big deal. The Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. Those are the 5 characteristics for 5 weeks of this series. He goes on to say, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of their parents to the 3rd and 4th generation. Now, this verse is fascinating. It's fascinating because it is such an important time in the history of Israel. It is fascinating because it is God commenting about himself. It is fascinating because these 5 characteristics are replicated over a dozen times in various verses. In other words, this is kind of who is God? This is a set piece. This is the nature of God. It's found in Exodus, in 2 Chronicles, in Psalms, Joel, and Jonah. So we've got it in books of history, in poetry, it's all over the place. That's why we can do 5 weeks on one verse. That's really unique. So this is an uber important verse, enough to put 5 weeks of a series on one single verse. And I want to begin with this characteristic of compassion. This particular Hebrew word comes from a root Hebrew word that also gives birth to the word womb. Womb, W-O-M-B. That's right, God has a womb. Or actually, we should say it this way. When mothers are fiercely protective of the product of their own womb, that mothers caring for their children, that heartbeat, that fierce, loyal love comes from the very nature of God. And God is actually described like a mother in Isaiah 49, verse 15. Can a woman forget her nursing child, that she should have no compassion on the son of her womb? Even though these may forget, yet I will not forget you. That is powerful. And this particular word for compassion is only used of God in the Old Testament. Like nobody else has that level of love. And when you turn to the New Testament, it is exclusive of Jesus. Mark 6:34, one of the worst days of Jesus' life. He's exhausted and he tells his disciples, let's go to the other side of the lake. Let's get away from these crowds that are oppressive. We need some R&R. But the crowds saw where he was going and literally ran 9 miles around the lake and beat him to the other side. When Jesus gets out of the boat, he sees 5,000 heads of households. This is the feeding of the 5,000. And the text says, when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd. And he had, here's the word, compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. Now, in the Old Testament, this word is only about God. In the New Testament, it's only about Jesus. Yet in the epistles, we are commanded for the first time to take on this characteristic of God and be compassionate. Why? Because the Spirit of Jesus is now in us. So the nature of God that engendered compassion of mothers to children can now create the same kind of compassion for strangers and even enemies. And that is something worth talking about.